as a movement, queer should be broad and focused on challenging all forms of marginalization, and particularly concerned with how people who are gender and sexual minorities in various ways are impacted. I see queer in the sense that queer activists of the 90s saw it as an umbrella term to kind of move past just, sexual orientation and to recognize that there are all sorts of different gender and sexual minorities out there, some of which, we cite in acronyms we use, LGBTQIA, plus whatever people have extra letters that they would put in or not put in. I think the acronym can sometimes get in the way in these conversations because it implies that some people are in and some people are not. But basically, I believe that if you're a gender or sexual minority in any way, that you fall under the umbrella of queer. The transgender movement of the 90s was really, really focused on the gender binary. And if you actually read, the Leslie Feinberg and Kate Bornstein and those books of the 90s, it was really focused on, hey, all of us, not just trans people, but all of us are hurt by this gender binary. And they would talk about people who we would think of as cisgender women and men today, like the gender binary hurts you too. And yet those conversations haven't really seeped into the mainstream, but awareness of transgender people as a marginalized group has. People will have different ideas about what the movement should be doing and shouldn't be doing, and we're going to have those arguments happen a lot. I would say personally that the root factor would be marginalization. That marginalization takes place in all sorts of ways, from everyday social interactions, where, say, as a trans person, someone might purposefully misgender me in a conversation. That is a seemingly small instance of marginalization, to other factors such as institutionalized marginalization, where there are, systems that I need to navigate, whether with regards to the government or with regards to healthcare, where the fact that I'm trans prevents me from accessing things that I need in order to survive and thrive in the world. I often find in queer spaces, people will insinuate that one person's expression or identity of gender or sexuality is reinforcing, the patriarchy or reinforcing the gender binary. And these arguments were made over and over again by feminists. And during the 1990s in the transgender movement of that era, there was a lot of talking about, no, trans people shatter the gender binary. And a lot of trans activists of that time talked about the ways in which their gender blurs distinctions. And that did a lot of good for trans people, and especially for people who are non-binary, trans people. Some of those arguments can be really powerful, but then that can lead to a situation where I was, where there's this assumption that if you're a transsexual, that you're not blurring the boundaries as much as someone, say, who is genderqueer identified. And again, this isn't about whether people are being sexist or not. This is about ranking people based upon their identities or how they express their genders or sexualities. when it becomes based upon identity rather than experiences, that can create this sharp binary that anytime you create a sharp binary, you're going to be leaving some people behind. And so I think that while the idea of creating safe spaces for different marginalized groups can be helpful, I think it's also important to know the 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 flaws that they often have or the problems that often recur. If I decide I'm going to create a trans only space, that can be helpful and useful for some of the people who are part of it, but it can also create a situation where there are arguments about whether this person who's gender questioning or gender queer, are they allowed in this space? How are we defining what trans is? A lot of times there's a respectability politics that comes into play where the most privileged members of whatever group it is fight for issues that they think are important to them, but it leaves behind people who are marginalized within their own communities in other different ways. You know, it's a failure to recognize intersectionality and lots of institutionalized oppression that exists. Sometimes in radical groups, there can be a tendency, at least within queer and feminist movements, for people to just create these new hierarchies with regards to gender and sexuality. I often find in queer spaces, you know, people will insinuate that one person's expression or identity of gender or sexuality is reinforcing, you know, the patriarchy or reinforcing the gender binary. And so that's a way in which radical groups can become exclusive. I think it's important to have conversations about privilege, but I'm not a big fan of using privilege as a way to kind of like hit people over the head, like your issues don't count because you're more privileged than I am. And I think I'm very hesitant to do that because as a trans woman, a common tactic within activist spaces historically for dismissing trans women's concerns are playing the male privilege card or the male socialization card. It's like, you know, you're more lucky or more privileged than cisgender women because you were born male, you were socialized male, and male privilege is a very real thing. I have written about it as a trans woman, how I've experienced it, how I no longer experience it. I think we can talk about it without using it as a way to like dismiss trans women's concerns outright. In challenging marginalization and challenging sexism, a lot of times we focus on the ism that's behind it, you know, and we will name these isms, whether it's traditional sexism or heterosexism or cissexism or racism or classism and so on, and we'll focus on that particular hierarchy and how we can challenge it. And I think that that's very useful and we should keep doing that work. But I also think that it is useful to think more generally about double standards. Any time in which we treat one group of people as less legitimate than another group of people. And so I kind of see that as rather than a top down, like looking at what the hierarchy is and fighting the hierarchy, looking at like bottom up, how do we place double standards on people and looking for signs that some form of marginalization may be happening, even if we don't know what the ism is that's going on behind it. We don't live in a world where like sexism happens over here and then racism happens in a completely different area. It's all happening everywhere. such that the racism that they would face would often be sexualized, and the sexism they face would be racialized. And so the idea is that all forms of sexism and marginalization all intersect with and exacerbate one another. For that reason, while lots of people face sexism, if you face other forms of marginalization in addition to that, the obstacles you face are going to be even more extreme and intense.
With people eating like ice cream cones on the march.
Some of the earliest conversations or arguments I remember having is like as a kid, it's like, oh, well, why won't you let me do that, Mom? You let them do it, like talking to your sibling, right? Like a sense of unfairness. And so maybe that's why those arguments work for everyday people to realize, hey, oh, transgender people are being treated unfairly. Okay, maybe we should stop that. But like, wow, capitalism. Like, I mean, capitalism is something that just creates huge amounts of inequity in our culture, but it's not, you can't point to like, capitalism isn't a person who we can point to and say they're behaving badly. It's like a fish critiquing water, right? Rather than focusing on what the person's identity is, focusing on the types of marginalization involved, I think is really crucial, because as a trans person, there are all sorts of ways in which my gender can be delegitimized and I can be marginalized because of my gender. And there are people who don't have my experiences per se, but who are viewed as and treated similarly by society. And I think that rather than focusing on whether that person shares the exact same identity as I do as a trans woman, I think it's far more useful for us to say, hey, there are these certain ways in which gender policing and the gender binary in our society is used to marginalize people. Let's work together to challenge that.